Video game crash of 1983. Atari, once the fastest growing company in America, grossing over $1 billion a year, was only a shadow of its former glory. While establishing video games in America, and essentially creating the market, the inner politics of the Atari company, influx of games from third-party developers, and total lack of quality control from the developers in the early 80s led to the crash of the video game industry as a whole. Starting as one of the most successful companies in America to a hollow shell of its former glory, because of the refusal of compromise between developers and the managers of Warner Communications, Atari suffered from a large amount of conflict between the different levels of company, those being the developers who created the games and the managers who ran the company. Have you ever had that feeling of going to an arcade with magnetic pole of the attractions? Well, a man named Nolan Bushnell knew that feeling very well. While in college, Nolan Bushnell worked as a manager for a carnival, where he observed people spending money on classic arcade games. Nolan Bushnell would go on to capture this feeling in the form of arcade machines. In 1972, taking inspiration from his time working at the carnival, Nolan Bushnell invented Pong, which would become one of the most influential games of all time. To become such a great success, he would need a means of selling this game. This is where Atari stepped in. With co-founder Ted Nabney, he and Bushnell created Atari, basing their game off watching people playing pinball and then describing their experience playing. Nolan Bushnell described how people playing pinball could relate over the common interest of the game as how young adults love to play games, and they're thirsty for social interaction, but a lot of bar and restaurant experiences are quite unsatisfactory on the social level. What young people need is a place that has the feel of an unhosted party, where they can find themselves interacting with like-minded strangers. When Pong hit the markets, it was an immediate success, selling over 100,000 units by 1974. Banking on this success, Atari would go to sell on more arcade machines. However, the success Bushnell received from various arcade machines was a curse in disguise. Creating arcade machines in 1974 was an uphill battle, since it would cost $1,000 to produce a cabinet and only sold for $900. Nolan Bushnell would decide to leave the industry in favor of working at Chuck E. Cheese, where he created the Pizza Time Theater. When Bushnell decided to leave Atari, he sold ownership to Warner Communications, a general media company. Working under Warner Communications created a large amount of conflict between new management, since even though Atari continued to flourish under Warner Communications, tighter deadlines and harsh working conditions continued to become worse and worse. What was once an office featuring near-weekly parties with a lax dress code became students' high only, and the inner workings of the company began to resemble the other offices which Warner Communications held. The higher levels of the company being described as, it was a ridiculous, excessive sort of fall of Rome kind of environment by a former employee of our Porsche.
This resulted in 4 employees breaking off and forming Activision on November 1st, 1979, who began developing games for the Atari 2600. Upset by this, Warner Communications sued Activision for infringing on their copyrighted material. Activision won the lawsuit, becoming the first third-party developer for Atari. This lawsuit inspired many startup companies to begin developing for the Atari 2600. With the massive influx of new companies and games, the market became heavily oversaturated, leading to many of these companies to crash and burn. Atari, under Warner Communications, would go on to develop many popular games for the Atari 2600, such as Pac-Man, Centipede, and Space Invaders. One thing to note about many of these games is, even though they were heavily popular, many of these games did not make a profit for Atari since they were completely overstocked. The biggest example of overstocking being Pac-Man, which at the time of the release was the best-selling home console game of all time, with an impressive 7 million copies sold, was still a financial flop since it left 5 million copies on store shelves, since it was predicted by Atari to have sold 12 million units. The other biggest example of this being E.T., which was famously known to have started the Atari crash since it was the biggest financial failure for Atari, selling only 500,000 of its 5 million stock. Because of the large amount of unsold games, the Atari landfill was created. a large dump in New Mexico where a large amount of unsold Atari games were dumped. The crash itself began on December 7, 1982, when Ray Kassar announced to stockholders the growth of the fourth quarter. During this time, many stockholders left the company, leaving much of the company out to dry. After this, Atari declared bankruptcy, selling its assets to different companies, leaving the company a shell of its former glory. Many former employees would leave the industry forever, key of which is Howard Warshaw, known for creating Yar's Revenge, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and most importantly, E.T., becoming a therapist for many upstarts like him who faced colossal failure after their company crashed and burned. The key thing Warshaw took from working at Atari and video games as a whole is that, in his own words, we have an expression in video games that greed kills. The time you die in a video game is usually when you're trying to get too many extra points. The crash of the video game industry was derived from the lack of compromise between developers and managers in Atari. Warner Communications' lack of experience in the video game industry led to large amounts of friction between the developers of the Atari company and the businessmen from Warner Communications, led to the crash of the video game industry and bankruptcy of Atari.